Welcome to our fifth and concluding Rehabilitation Services Administration Technical Assistance Program on prior approval. My name is Terry Martin, Technical Assistance Specialist in the Rehabilitation Services Administration State Monitoring and Improvement Division Technical Assistance Unit. The presenter for this program on prior approval is Julia Doyle, a Financial Management Specialist in the Fiscal Unit at RSA State Monitoring and Improvement Division, and David Steele, the Chief of RSA's Fiscal Unit. This technical assistance program will provide information about prior approval requirements specific to State Vocational Rehabilitation Services Program participant costs and additional information regarding prior approval request submissions. Julia?
Thank you, Terry. As Terry mentioned, this is the fifth and final webinar in a series of 5 related to prior approval for certain grant activities that require prior approval. Unlike the first 3 prior approval webinars that we have done, which were applicable to all grant awards, this and the previous one on general purpose equipment are only applicable to the VR service program. In particular, we are talking about participant support costs specifically related to Technical Assistance Circular 1802. A little bit of a background. OMB's Uniform Administrative Requirements, Cost Principles and Audit Requirements for Federal Awards, which we call the Uniform Guidance, which was codified at 2 CFR 200, includes requirements for prior approval for various grant award activities and proposed obligations and expenditures. We encourage you to read 2 CFR 200-407, which details all of the instances on prior approval, and review previous webinars that we have presented related to prior approval. In response to prior approval, RSA issued Technical Assistance Circular 1802 on April 11, 2018, explaining the applicability of prior approval to grantees and including a streamlined approach for 2 cost categories. This technical assistance covers only those items of cost specified in the Technical Assistance Circular. Other items not specifically talked about in this prior approval session must be submitted separately. Just a quick reminder of what prior approval is. Prior approval is related to different items that require prior approval from RSA for an obligation or an expenditure. It must be written and it must be submitted either before the obligation is incurred or the expenditure. What may be streamlined? Technical Assistance Circular 1802 allows VR agencies to request prior approval in the aggregate for an entire federal fiscal year for the VR grant award only for 2 cost categories regarding prior approval. The streamlined approach for the 2 cost categories requiring prior approval is due to the administration's commitment and desire to provide flexibility to state VR agencies within the scope of the requirement. The 2 categories are general purpose equipment, as defined in 2 CFR 200-48, and that topic is covered in a separate webinar, and participant support costs in accordance with 2 CFR 200-456. Please review the prior approval webinars for other additional categories. So what are participant support costs? Participant support costs are allowable with prior approval of the federal awarding agency. They are defined in 2 CFR 275 as direct costs for items such as stipends, substance allowance, travel allowance, registration fees paid to or on behalf of participants or trainees, but not employees, in connection with conferences or training projects. Very important to know it's not employees, so not employees of the VR agency. You do not have to request prior approval if an employee of the VR agency is traveling for a conference or training project. Conferences are defined in 2 CFR 200-432. They are defined as a meeting, retreat, seminar, symposium, workshop, or event whose primary purpose is disseminating technical information beyond the non-federal entity and is reasonable for the successful performance of the VR award. So it really covers a lot of information and it's pretty general. If it's specifically for the dissemination of technical information beyond the non-federal entity, it is considered a conference. Participant support costs do not include conference support costs, such as the facility or audio-visual equipment rental. Participant support costs are specific to the costs associated with attending the event, such as the travel, hotel, stipend. It does not include those costs associated with hosting the event, such as facility rental or equipment rental. It does not include travel and travel-related costs for agency employees, as I mentioned previously. It does not include costs associated with a consumer traveling to and from a CRP or a vendor in receipt of VR services. And it does not include consumer maintenance and education training costs pursuant to an individualized plan for employment. So what about State Rehab Council participant support costs? And we bring this up because it's mentioned in a little bit of detail in Technical Assistance Circular 1802. We do encourage grantees to read it if they have not. In that circular, RSA granted prior approval for all participant support costs state VR agencies will incur with respect to the SRC and independent commission members attending required meetings to fulfill their statutorily mandated functions under Section 101A21 and 105C of the Rehabilitation Act. Therefore, state VR agencies are not required to submit prior approval requests for these particular participant support costs. While a state may impose additional requirements for SRC or independent commission members, the prior approval granted in Technical Assistance Circular 1802 is specific to members attending required meetings to fulfill their statutorily mandated functions. This does not include state-mandated commissions that are not federally mandated. The prior approval for SRC participant support costs granted in TAC 1802 is limited to regular SRC and subcommittee meetings. It does not include SRC committee member participation on other committees or work groups. Additionally, the prior approval provided in SRC regular committee meetings and subcommittee meetings is not applicable to VR funds used to support state independent living council meetings. Therefore, such expenditures still require prior approval. Additionally, it does not cover additional conferences. So, for example, participant support costs for attendance at CSAVR would still require prior approval. Please continue to send individual requests for those and for prior approval for participant support costs for state independent living council meetings. So what costs may be submitted in aggregate? Prior approval for participant support costs may be submitted in the aggregate based on reasonable budget estimates for an entire federal fiscal year. It must be submitted for a federal fiscal year, not in a state fiscal year, and it must be applicable under a particular federal award. You can submit it for the following categories. VR consumers attending conferences, such as those presented in connection with the provision of pre-employment transition services. SRC and independent commission members attending conferences, such as those hosted by the Council for the State Administrators of Vocational Rehabilitation, CSAVR, and the National Council on Independent Living, NICL, and Randolph-Shepard vendors attending BEP Randolph-Shepard trainings. So as I had mentioned previously, we did not grant a waiver for requests for participant support costs for the SRC to attend conferences like CSAVR. However, you can submit those requests in the aggregate form. Grantees are still required to ensure costs are allocable. If portions of a conference are unallowable VR expenditures or do not directly benefit the grant, grantees are still required to ensure the costs of the conference or training events are allocated. Additionally, states must follow any provisions within their state travel policies requiring a deduction to per diem or substance reimbursement costs, like when a meal is provided as part of a conference, And as a reminder, if state funds are used to pay for the unallocable portion of the conference expenditures, those expenditures would not be an allowable source of match for the VR program. So what to consider when developing your budget estimates? Budget estimates in the aggregate must be based on reliable cost estimates. For example, current bids, reasonable cost research if it's general purpose equipment, and they must be expected to incur in the given federal fiscal year. A reasonable budget estimate can include projections of obligations and expenditures. When developing budget estimates, grantees should consider the following factors: prior federal fiscal year obligations and expenditures under each category, minor inflationary adjustments that may be needed, and anticipated changes in per diem costs, or potential changes in service delivery that may affect request expenditures such as implementation or removal of an order of selection. As mentioned, the agency should have a process to ensure unallowable expenditures are appropriately considered in the development of the budget, and agencies should have written policies and procedures related to prior approval and internal controls. And we discussed this in a little bit more detail in the first webinar on prior approval. An agency's internal control process should probably include a description of how the agency will develop the reliable cost estimate and ensure that the agency does not exceed the estimate without requesting additional prior approval for additional anticipated expenditures.
Thank you, Julia. Let's turn our attention to the submission of a prior approval request and what's necessary to include in a prior approval request.
RSA has developed a template prior approval spreadsheet that VR agencies may use when submitting aggregate participant support costs prior approval requests. The template's not required, but was developed to assist agencies in submitting requests for prior approval. Additionally, the use of the template does not guarantee prior approval or that additional information may not be requested from RSA, nor does it mean that RSA may not take further enforcement action in the future, but using the spreadsheet will assist in the timely processing of participant support costs prior approval requests. If you would like a copy of the spreadsheet, please contact the RSA Financial Management Specialist assigned to your agency. Requests for aggregate approval of participant support costs should be submitted to the agency's assigned RSA Financial Management Specialist 60 days before the start of the new federal fiscal year. This will provide RSA sufficient time to respond to the request and follow up with the agency in the event that there are any questions. What should you include in your request? The following information must be included in prior approval requests for participant support costs submitted in accordance with the Technical Assistance Circular. Grantee name and state, grantee award name and the federal fiscal year award for which the request is being made. Grantees can pay for expenditures that require prior approval with federal or federal or non-federal funds or program income, as we've mentioned in previous webinars, but they must still request prior approval regardless of how the expenditures are paid for. That is why we need to know what the federal fiscal year award to which the request is being made. They should include the contact information in case of questions regarding submission. And for VR consumers attending conferences, such as those presented in connection with the provision of pre-employment transition services, you should include the estimated number of VR consumers and an aggregate amount of anticipated costs. For SRC and independent commission members attending conferences, again, please provide the estimate total number of members and the aggregate amount of anticipated costs. For the Business Enterprise Program, the BEP Randolph-Shepard vendors attending BEP Randolph-Shepard training, provide the estimated total number of vendors and the aggregate amount of anticipated costs. Please note that VR agencies are not required to submit a categorical breakdown of the total estimated amount when submitted as streamlined prior approval requests. However, grantees are still required to maintain supporting documentation that may be subject to review to ensure the validity of the estimated costs. And as a reminder, as with all federal expenditures or non-federal expenditures used to support the VR program, grantees must ensure that costs are necessary and reasonable for the performance of the federal award. Costs must be adequately documented, and costs are allocable based upon the relative benefit received in the program. So I have an example. A state VR agency could submit a prior approval request for an aggregate estimate of $20,000 to cover the participant support costs of 5 SRC members to attend the CSA VR conference during a given federal fiscal year. The state VR agency may submit a prior approval request that projects an aggregate estimate for all participant support costs in one prior approval request. However, again, it's important that grantees maintain internal controls and documentation on how that information was determined to determine and support allowability of such costs. So regarding the streamlined approach, VR agencies, they maintain responsibility for ensuring that all expenditures are allowable and allocable to the VR program in accordance with the Uniform Administrative Requirements. This is specifically in 2 CFR 200-403 through 405 that talk about reasonableness, allowability, allocability, how that has to be cost allocated based on the relative benefit received. It is also the state VR agency's responsibility to ensure that the funds used to pay for the projected costs are funds available for use and obligation in the period of performance for that federal fiscal year and reported on the appropriate financial report. Additionally, state VR agencies must maintain appropriate documentation, as we had mentioned, for all approved streamlined and non-streamlined prior approval requests. Regardless of how it's submitted, they should maintain documentation, and they may be subject to audits or monitoring activities. This would be applicable to conferences that may include sessions that do not directly benefit the grant or are unallowable via the cost principles. Additionally, if prior approval is approved for a conference in one period of performance under a federal fiscal year award, and the conference does not occur, prior approval does not roll over into future periods of performance under different federal awards. And as mentioned, costs must be adequately documented. And as mentioned previously in different sessions presented throughout this webinar and the previous webinars, prior approval for participant support costs cannot be obtained after the costs have been incurred. It must be submitted for request and approval before the costs occur. So just some considerations for agencies to think about as they are working on their submissions for requests. As mentioned previously, expenditures must be in accordance with the state agency's travel policies, the state or the agency's travel policies. Some states have extremely specific travel policies for all items of travel. It is important for VR agencies to be able to demonstrate that their expenditures are in accordance with their own state policies. A great example, state policies vary greatly on allowable expenditures related to hotels. Some state policies specify that hotel reimbursement rates are only allowable at the GSA rate, while some allow for reimbursement of the hotel in which the event is occurring. That could be extremely different costs. So it's very important that states know their own agencies, their own state and their own agency's policies and procedures. The agency's internal controls must ensure that no costs for prohibited lobbying expenditures are paid with VR funds. This would be applicable to any conference in which lobbying may occur. Agencies would have to demonstrate with their own internal controls that they are separating out those costs. And costs that do not benefit the VR award must be allocated to sources other than the award. If a participant is attending a conference that does have some VR purposes, but maybe some of the sessions are not VR purposes, then those costs cannot be allocated to the VR award.
Thank you, Julia. RSA and the fiscal unit have received a number of questions, general questions related to prior approval, and it may be helpful to review some of the responses that we have provided to those general prior approval questions. Julia, what participant support costs requiring prior approval include a presenter being brought in to provide staff training?
No. In accordance with 2 CFR 200-472, they would not need to request prior approval. The cost of training and education provided by employee development is allowable.
Do participant support costs paid for CRP employees or contractors require prior approval?
It's a good question, and we get that question all the time. Yes. Since these costs are not included in the streamlined approach, agencies would have to submit separate requests for prior approval for these instances. It is important also to remember that such costs must be allocated to all benefiting programs.
Are there instances when prior approval would be required for VR consumers?
Yes, there are. An example is if a potentially eligible student who was to attend a pre-employment transition conference during the summer, prior approval would be required. However, for those particular requests, that cost could be included in the aggregated cost for VR consumers attending conferences. It's still required, but it can be submitted via the aggregate approach.
Thank you, Julia. Should you have additional questions related to the content of this particular technical assistance program on prior approval, or other general questions related to the content of the series on RSA's technical assistance programs on prior approval, please do direct those to our mailbox at rsafiscal.ed.gov. If you have a specific question related to a purchase or your agency, a particular item, please refer those and send those directly to your RSA's State Fiscal Liaison. We thank you for participating in this program, and we also invite you to review all of the programs in this Rehabilitation Services Administration Technical Assistance Series on prior approval and its requirements. Thank you so much.